What's up, everybody? Hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. On this week's episode of Not Your Average Meta, we took our channel on the road and went down to Taylorville to the Hobby Horse, one of my favorite LGSs in Illinois. First up this week, we have a newcomer to the Thunderdome, Eric, piloting his Nethroi Apex of Death deck. This deck looks to take advantage of his free sack outlets and graveyard recursion for a ton of ETB value. Next, we have Foil back with us playing his Innistrad Vampire Queen, Olivia Voldaren. This deck is a vampire tribal deck that looks to cast as a vampire army while using Olivia's ability to turn his opponent's creatures into vampires to steal away for his own use. Next, we have Fogrel playing his newly built Urabrask the Hidden deck. This deck is the definition of the saying, I only know one speed, and that speed is 100%. Every creature in this deck either has an activated ability or an attack trigger that benefits from having haste. Finally, we have Justin stepping out of his Dimir box and playing an upgraded pre-con version of Ranar the Ever-Watchful. This deck looks to exile and blink permanents for ETB value in order to win the game. Now that we have our fighters, let's step into the Thunderdome and see which deck will come out on top. Foil plays a snow-covered swamp. Fog plays a mountain. Justin plays a tapped prayer stream and passes. Eric plays a marsh flats, then cracks it for a tapped overgrown tomb. Foil plays a mountain and passes. Fog plays another mountain, taps one for Strike It Rich, creating a treasure token. Justin draws, taps one to play a Paladin class. Eric draws and plays a Wooded Foothills, cracking to go get a Canopy Vista. Foil draws and passes, discarding down to 7. Fog plays another mountain, then taps 3 for Krinko 10th Street Kingpin. Justin draws and plays a Terramorphic Expanse, sacking it to go get an island. He then passes. Eric draws and plays an Andatha Triumph and passes. Foil plays a Swamp for turn that taps 3 for Anji Falconwrath. Fog plays a Drownyard Temple for turn that taps 5 to cast his commander Urabrask the Hidden. He then swings Krinko Justin, creating 2 goblins. Justin taps for turn, then taps 2 for an Intangible Virtue. Eric draws for turn and plays a Sunpetal Grove. He then taps 3 to cast Yavimaya Druid. In response, Foil uses Anji to discard and draw. Foil on taps for turn, draws, and passes. Fog on taps for turn, plays a mountain, then taps 4 for the sad robot to go get another mountain. Fog then swings Urabrask at Foil, Krinko at Eric, and his goblins and Solomon at Justin. He then gets 3 more goblins. Justin plays a Tranquil Cove for turn, gaining a life. He then taps 2 for a Supreme Phantom and passes. Eric starts his turn by untapping and then tapping 3 to sacrifice his Yavimaya Elder, going to get 2 basic lands. He then taps 1 to play an Esper Sentinel, and then he plays a Plains for turn. At the end of his turn, Foil uses Anji to discard an Asylum Visitor, casting it for its madness cost, and draws a card. He then discards another card and draws. Foil taps for turn and draws. He then taps 2 and casts Tormenting Voice, discarding a card and drawing 2. He then plays a Swamp and casts Vampire Hexmage. Fog begins his turn by untapping all of his permanents. He then goes to his upkeep and draws a card for turn. Taps 3 for Hardened Berserker. He then goes to combat and swings Krinko into Berserker Justin, Solomon Urabrask at Eric, and his 5 goblins at Foil. Foil blocks 2 goblins and everyone else takes their hits. Fog then casts Pirate's Pillage, discarding, drawing 2, and getting 2 treasures. He then plays a mountain for turn and passes. Justin taps for turn, then draws. He then plays a Sajiri Refuge, gaining a life. He then taps 3 and levels up his Paladin class. Eric draws for turn and plays a Swamp. He then taps 1 for a Viscera Seer, then taps 5 more for a Thragtusk. At the end of his turn, Foil discards another card and draws. Foil draws for turn and passes. Fog and taps for turn, combines all his goblins together and draws. He then taps 2 for Ornithopter of Paradise and then 3 more for Jaya Valor. He then uses Jai's ability, discarding a card, in order to deal 3 damage to Esper Sentinel, killing him. After taking out Eric's Esper Sentinel, he goes to combat. He then swings Solomon Krinko at foil, Urabrask Berserker Eric, and his 8 goblins at Justin. In response, foil taps 3, then pays 4 life to cast Active Aggression, stealing Urabrask. Foil then uses Urabrask to block Krinko, and his Vampire Hexmage to block Solemn. Everybody else declares no blocks and takes their damage. Urabrask then goes back to Fog's command zone, and Solemn dies, allowing Fog to draw a card. Fog then plays Command Beacon for turn, and he casts Latula, Keldon Overseer before going to his end step. At the end of turn, Foil exiles a black card and casts Force of Despair, destroying all the creatures that came into play this turn. Fog then sacks all his creatures he played for this turn and passes. After Fog's board has been wiped, Justin goes to his upkeep and he draws a card. He then taps 4 and he casts his commander, Ranar the Ever-Watchful, and then he foretells a card from his hand, creating a spirit token before passing. Eric on taps return, plays a Woodland Cemetery, then taps out to cast Casualties of War. He then destroys Fog's Krinko and Command Beacon and Justin's Intangible Virtue. At the end of turn, Foil uses Anji to discard and draw. Foil draws return and plays a Snow-Covered Swamp. He then taps 4 and casts his commander, Olivia Voldaren. He then swings 3 damage at Fog and passes. Fog on taps return, and then he draws. Then he goes to combat swinging 7 goblins at Eric, who blocks 1 and takes 6. He then passes. Justin draws return and plays Cryptic Caves before foretelling another card, creating another spirit token, and passing. Eric on taps, then draws return. He then plays an Orzhov Basilica for turn, bouncing a land back to his hand. He then casts a Worldly Tutor, then shortcuts before tutoring, and casts Luminous Broodmoth. He then goes to look for a card, tutoring Elishnor to the top of his library and passes. Foil on taps, and draws for turn. He then taps 3 for Rakish Air. He then goes to combat swinging everybody at Fog. Fog takes a hit, going down to 29 life. Fog draws, then plays a Mountain. He then taps 7 and casts Brass's Bounty, creating 8 treasures. He then swings his 5 goblins at foil. Justin draws, then taps 2 for a Thought Vessel and passes. Eric starts his turn by untapping all of his lands. He then goes to his draw step and he draws the Elishnor he tutored for. He then plays a land for turn and taps out in order to cast an Entwined Tooth and Nail. Justin then saves the table by countering with a Dovin's Veto. Eric then swings his Thragtusk at Fog, who blocks his Berserker, then Eric passes. Foil on taps return. He then plays a tapped Temple of Malice, scrying 1. He then taps 5 for a Palace Siege and naming cons. He then swings out at Fog again, taking him down to 16. Fog on taps, and then taps 7 to recast Urabrask. He then used some of his treasures to cast Combustible Gearhulk, choosing Justin on ETB, knowing he'll let him draw 3 cards. He then plays a Mountain for turn. Fog then uses the rest of his treasures to cast a Howling Golem. He then goes to combat swinging everyone but his goblins at foil. Everybody draws up the Golem trigger, Foil blocks the Golem with Anji, and then he goes down to 11. Justin untaps a turn, and then he draws. He then taps 5 and he levels up his Paladin class to level 3. He then goes to combat swinging his commander at foil with the Paladin trigger, taking him out of the game while the rest go at Fog. At the end of his turn, Eric sacks his Thragtusk and Visvaseer, scrying while returning to the field with the Broodmoth. Eric untaps for turn and then draws, and then plays a Windswept Heath for turn. He then cracks the Heath to get a forest. Eric then taps enough to cast a Protean Hawk. At this point, the game's pretty much already over. He goes into his library after sacking the Protean Hawk to the Viscera Seer in order to go get a Fleshbag Marauder, making all of us sacrifice a creature, and also a Renegade Rallier. Eric then sacks Fleshbag Marauder, returning to the field, making sack another creature. He then uses his Revolt trigger to bring back his Esper Sentinel. He then sacks his Rallier, bringing it back, giving him multiple Revolt triggers, returning multiple fetch lands to play. He then sacks all the fetch lands he's returned to go get lands to put him on the battlefield. He then sacks Protean Hulk again, going to get Veteran Explorer, Eternal Witness, and Dati Voidwalker. He then returns Fleshbag back again, making us sack more creatures. He then sacks the Fleshbag yet again, making us sack another creature. Fog finally starts his turn by untapping and drawing. He taps 3 to cast a Hazard's Monument. He then taps another 4 in order to cast a reduced cost Brash's Taunter. He then taps 2 more and he casts a Bucknard's Everfull Purse. He then swings out at Eric and everybody draws off the Golem trigger. Eric blocks Fog's biggest 3 creatures and takes 1. Justin taps for turn and draws, looking for an answer. He then plays a tapped Seachrome Coast. Justin then taps 4 in order to play a Late to Dinner. He targets a Supreme Phantom in his graveyard, bringing him back into play, as well as getting a food token before passing his turn to Eric. Eric untaps for turn to plays a Bright Climb Pathway. After which he tries to recast an Entwined Tooth and Nail. This then gets countered again by Justin with a negate. He then swings at Fog, taking him out, and casts Crows and Grip to destroy Justin's Paladin class. Justin starts his turn by untapping, and then he just taps enough to cast a Mist Meadow Witch and then passes the turn. Eric starts his turn by drawing and playing a land for turn. He then casts Elish Norn, leaving Justin with 1 creature. He then goes to combat, swinging out at Justin, taking him out of the game, while Foil and Fog swap mountains out of their decks on the other side of the table. Congratulations to Eric, who not only made his first appearance on the channel today, but also got his first win piloting his Nethroi deck. What can I say, we should have played more Graveyard Hate. The MVP of today's game is Luminous Broodmoth. The ability to sack your creatures to get reoccurring ETBs is good, but making them fly so they're harder to block as well? Now that's OP. Thanks for watching, and be on the lookout for more games and decks you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.